Thank you, everybody. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank Dr. Olaya and the Congress for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about strategies in cellular therapy, both for acute lymphoblastic leukemia, because that's where most of the work has been done, and in a little bit in non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in children. Some of this work is work that we've done at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and some of it then is work that's been done in other places. So why do we even need immunotherapy? We're doing a great job with ALL. Survival in acute lymphoblastic leukemia is better than it's been ever. But what we do know is that children who relapse more than once continue to have a dismal prognosis. Probably less than 10% of children in second relapse can be salvaged. So we still need some therapies for those patients. And when you think about B-cell lymphomas in adults and children, again, children are getting treated in the first time, as we've heard today, very well with high survivals. But particularly now in the age of rituximab, patients who have received rituximab-containing therapy, and you can see on these graphs, actually have a very low chance of surviving at the time of relapse because we don't have good relapse therapy for those patients. So the whole rationale for immunotherapy is that we want that mutated and potentially malignant cells are cleared by the immune system every day. And so when a patient has a hematologic malignancy, you worry that the cancer cells are somehow using the immune system controls to escape immune regulation. And we think about that in terms of tolerance and in terms of immune checkpoints. And in tolerance, I think that antigen targeting to bypass that immune tolerance is the reason that CAR T therapy and other immunotherapies are working. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So cellular immunity with CAR T cells, the CAR stands for chimeric antigen receptor. And this is a cartoon that describes what the CAR looks like. You have the CAR itself, and it links this extracellular antibody to an intracellular T signaling domain. The antibody then, we hope, up here will bind the antigen. It engages the CAR here. And then we hope that the cytotoxic response will then kill the antigen-presenting cell. When you're selecting a target antigen for a CAR, you want to pick an antigen that is ideally universally expressed in the tumor cells or the bad cells, but not really expressed on normal cells. And so for this, CD19 is great because it's universally expressed on B cells and in B cell malignancies, but the expression is restricted to B cells and we really don't see it anywhere else in the body. When you need to make the engineering of CAR T cells is complicated. The T cells are first collected from the patient, so this is an autologous product. The cells are then genetically engineered with a lentiviral. At CHOP, we use a lentiviral vector. Other places use sometimes retroviral vectors to express the CAR. The T cells are then expanded outside of the patient, so in the lab, ex vivo. And then they're reinfused into the patient. And the concept is that they'll come into contact with the antigen, that is CD19. They'll engage the CAR. The T cells will then kill the cells, and the B cells will go away. And then these T cells will continue to proliferate in the patient and continue to kill B cells. We think that persistent CAR T cells may allow long-term disease control, although I think that's still a little bit of a question. So this is just a cartoon of what the T cells look like, killing the cells. And essentially the goals for a modern CAR T therapy are that you want the cells to proliferate because we think that the proliferation and ongoing growth of those cells correlates with the response of the leukemia. And you want them to persist because we think that they need to stay around for a while in order to maintain the remission in the patient. The length of persistence in these cells that we need for long-term disease control, I think at this point is not known. When you compare CARs, there are many different centers now are making CAR T cells directed against CD19. And I just have a few cartoons here. This is the pen CHOP one that uses a lentivirus. And this is the intracellular domain, a 4-1BB with a CD3Z. It's not important to understand that. Just to know that at Memorial Sloan Kettering, they're using a different intracellular domain and they're transfecting with a retrovirus. At the National Cancer Institutes, they use a retrovirus and the same thing, but a little bit of a different antibody. So everybody is constructing these cells a little bit differently. And the goals are to get a cell that persists and expands and proliferates. Everybody thinks theirs does the best job, and actually different ones do a little bit differently at each of those things. Proliferation, again, is really key. And so this is just a series of flow plots that look at blood in a patient who has received CAR T therapy. And it's just to show, so CD3 T cells, this gate here is cells that are T cells that express CD19. And you can see on day 1 when you infuse into a patient, there's nothing there. And then we need it to persist at day 15 and into day 21. In the first patients that have been treated up to 7 years ago, there are still patients who continue to have persistence of these cells up to 7 years. So again, just a cartoon of how we do this. The patient is leukapheresed and T cells are collected from the patient. They actually go to the lab and are attached to antibody-coated beads, and then the T cells are activated and transduced. The CAR is attached to the T cell. They undergo a modified T cell expansion in the laboratory. The beads are removed again, and then the product is infused back into the patient. So the patient gets the infusion. Hopefully the cells distribute within the patient. They proliferate, and then we get a cytokine release response. So this is an examination of bone marrow. One of the ways that we look at the effectiveness of the CAR T therapy is to look at the expression of B cells in the patient. And so this is a bone marrow flow plots from a patient on day -1, the day right before the infusion, and day 28 after the infusion. And you can see that there are lots of B cells in this patient at day -1, but at day 28, all of the B cells continue. It's very complicated to create these. It took lots of years to figure out how to make them. The initial trial in children was done at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia and reported out actually by Shannon Maud first at ASCO in 2016. And the initial trial was a phase 1 trial that enrolled 60 children, mean age of 11. 65% of these patients had had a previous bone marrow transplant. About half of the children at the time they were treated had more than 5% blasts in the bone marrow, so some significant leukemic burden. About a fourth of the patients had undetectable disease in the bone marrow but had been multiply relapsed. And also in that group, most of the children did not have CNS disease, but there were a substantial number of children who either had blasts at the time of infusion or had had CNS blasts within the previous 12 months. And so what happened to these children? Of the 60 children that were infused CAR T cells, 56 had a complete remission within the time of the infusion. So that's tremendous. It was able to show that those cells were infusible. They infused, they proliferated, and they killed the leukemic cells. So that's great. At 12 months, though, only about 60% of those patients were still in a remission. So there was a rapid gain of remission, but then a fall off. And at 24 months, 53% of those patients continued to be in remission. So while we get a great complete response, there's clearly a fall off, and I don't think we know how far that is going to go at this point. Also important to note, of the 15 patients with any CNS disease, 11 of them actually got control and remained in relapse. I'm sorry, let me go back to this. 24 patients remained in a continuous remission more than 1 year, 19 without further therapy. 7 of those patients proceeded to stem cell transplant. This actually brings up a controversy that I'm probably not going to discuss much here, but I think there's still a lot of controversy about whether children who go into remission with CAR T cells should then go on to stem cell transplant, because we don't ultimately know the long-term survival of these children. And we argue this a lot at our center. CHOP is very pro-CAR, and so we tend to not go to transplant, but some patients do. And so the patients who went to transplant went at the decision of their doctor and the parents, and not for any biologic reason. Of the patients with CNS disease, again, 11 of the 15 are in a continuous remission as long as 3.5 years. 4 of them had bone marrow relapses. And interestingly, 98% of all patients treated at this point have had the modified CAR T cells detectable in CSF. So it appears to be effective not just for bone marrow disease, but for CNS disease as well, central nervous system disease. Spinal taps out to 1 year have demonstrated persistence of the CAR T cells in the cerebral spinal fluid. And at this point, of all the children that we know of, there have been no central nervous system relapses. So all of the relapses that you see on that plot were bone marrow relapses. So after that phase 1 trial, a phase 2 trial was done. It was nicknamed Eliana. And this is unimportant, I think, to look at all of this, but essentially 107 patients were screened, 92 were enrolled, only 75 of those were actually able to get the infusion. I will say that this continues to be true. For every patient, every 10 patients that we screen, we probably only infuse 7, because there is a time frame involved in collecting the cells, transfecting, getting the cell product ready and giving it back to the child. Usually that's anywhere from a minimum of 1 month to 2.5 months. And then in that time period, many children become ineligible. So anyway, in the phase 2 trial, 75 children underwent infusion. And again, a very high complete response rate initially, 81% went right into remission. The relapse-free survival in this study was 80% at 6 months, down to 59% at 12 months. Again, so a great response initially, but we're losing up almost half of the children in the first year to relapse. The duration of response, again, we don't really know. And of those kids, 8 of them went to transplant. So it muddies the numbers a little bit when some of the kids go to transplant and then you don't know if they're surviving because of the transplant or the CAR cells. Not just CHOP and Penn are doing this. Other centers have CARs that have treated both children and adults. Memorial Sloan Kettering has a CAR that's a little bit different than the CHOP one. They treated 46 adults with relapsed and refractory BALL. They had a complete response of 91%, so that was great. In patients with a bigger disease burden, they had a little bit less of a CR. Their 6-month overall survival, though, 75%, and 57% in patients with disease. So again, a rapid CR, but a fall off. The National Cancer Institute's 61% complete response rate in 38 children and adults with relapsed and refractory B-cell ALL. The median leukemia-free survival was almost 18 months, but almost all of those patients went to transplant after their CAR T therapy. And then Seattle, the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center, used a little bit of a different CAR than the others. They saw in 29 adults with refractory and relapsed disease a 93% CR, and again, sustained remissions in 13 patients only of the 29, and 8 of them went to stem cell transplant. So I think everybody's getting good initial results, but it's still, we're waiting to see what the long-term results are going to be. I want to talk a little bit about the toxicity, because I'm sure everybody's heard about the toxicity of CAR T therapy. And the biggest toxicity that we see, there are 3 basically toxicities that are big. The first is this cytokine release syndrome. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in detail, but it correlates with T cell proliferation and efficacy. So as the T cells go into the child and proliferate, that's when we see the CRS. It seems to be related to the disease burden. We can reverse it with IL-6 therapy, and I'll talk about that. And it seems to act a lot like HLH. We've seen in some patients neurotoxicity. Most of the neurotoxicity that we've seen looks like encephalopathy. The patients just get encephalopathic. It's been seen in many of the trials. In our experience at CHOP, we don't treat it, and it goes away completely. And then, of course, because this is an anti-B cell therapy, the patients, as long as the T cells are working, will not have B cells, and so they have no antibody. So these children are getting monthly infusions of IVIG because they're IVIG dependent. So this is I know this is kind of too small to see, but this is the adverse event chart from the Eliana, the phase 2 trial. And again, cytokine release syndrome, so a 1/4 of the patients had a grade 4 CRS, and 20% of them had a grade 3 CRS. So almost half of the patients having a significant cytokine release syndrome. We also had about 5% of patients have the encephalopathy, and those were the most significant adverse events. The other thing I think it's important to notice is that this chart is divided into adverse events that happened at less than 8 weeks from therapy and greater than 8 weeks. And as you can see, almost all of the toxicity happens within 2 months of infusion. And once you get out to about 2 months, there's virtually no toxicity other than the B-cell aplasia. So the cytokine release syndrome, it's related to the T-cell expansion. We think it's probably necessary for the effectiveness of the therapy. The symptoms typically occur anywhere from 1 to 14 days after the product is infused. And it ranges from, on the low end, from just some fever, some muscle pain, some nausea and vomiting, to severe hypotension, respiratory distress, renal insufficiency, and coagulopathy. And we think, that, again, that the severity of the CRS scales with the disease burden. So from a symptom management point of view, well, at the low end, you can just use antipyretics, pain medicine, maybe a little bit of antiemetics. But at the high end, these children need ICU support. They're getting vasopressors, they're getting respiratory support, and they're getting a lot of blood products. So when we talk about the CRS, we've noticed that it seems to mirror HLH, and I know there was a talk about HLH yesterday. The symptoms that we see in the CRS are very similar to HLH. We see systemic inflammatory response with a vascular leak, hypotension, and respiratory and renal insufficiency. We see hepatosplenomegaly, elevated liver enzymes, and hyperbilirubinemia. A coagulopathy that's marked by a low fibrinogen, extraordinarily high ferritin levels, so anywhere in the tens to the hundreds of thousands in these patients. And it's reversible with cytokine blockade, specifically IL-6 blockade with tocilizumab. Interestingly, 2 of the patients that we've treated that have had very high, very bad cytokine release syndrome were actually then found to have perforin mutations that were potentially disposing to HLH. So this is just a case schematic of a 21-year-old young man that we treated at CHOP. He started out, his bone marrow had 90% blasts at the time of his infusion. Because of that, the docs actually decided to split the infusion in 2 to maybe not give him everything at once. On day +2 after his infusion, he developed fever. Day +3, very high fevers with confusion in the beginning of encephalopathy. By day 4, he was hypotensive and in the ICU, so this is very quick. And at day 5, we actually treated him with tocilizumab. I have a schematic of some of what happened to him. And again, this is the very far severe end of the CRS, but it shows you what can happen. This is, so here's days 1 to 17. We treated him on days 1 and 2 with the CAR-T infusion, and you can see right away his fever goes up and stays up for almost over 2 weeks. The LDH goes up and peaks around day 9 and 10, which we think correlates with the killing of the leukemia cells, and then goes back down. He was so sick, requiring high-dose steroids, respiratory support, pressors, that he received tocilizumab on days 5 and 8, and seemed to have a very good response to the blocking of the interleukin-6. Just another schematic to show the severe coagulopathy that we see in these patients. Here we have the same timeline. Infusion of the CAR-T started, the fibrinogen went down almost immediately by day 4 or 5 and stayed low. And the PT and PTT elevated, and this patient required lots of blood products. When you look at the high ferritin levels in these patients, it's clear that the patients, it's kind of obvious, I guess, but the patients with the severe CRS have much higher ferritin levels than the patients without severe CRS. We also see that the patients with the very severe CRS here and here have elevated levels of interleukin-6 relative to the patients who don't have CRS, and they have elevated levels of interferon gamma relative to the patients who don't have a CRS. Again, feeling like HLH to us. Just a word about tocilizumab, because this is now what we're using to shut the CRS down, and this is an agent that we've also begun to use in HLH in our center. It's an IL-6 receptor antagonist, as you know. It blocks IL-6 mediated effects. It's, by our FDA, officially indicated for juvenile idiopathic arthritis, for rheumatoid arthritis, and in Japan, it's actually indicated for multi-system Castleman's disease, something that we don't see, at least in Philadelphia, very much. We give it once or twice, and it's very effective. It has very rare side effects, just of a little bit of elevation of the liver enzymes and some neutropenia, but not much else. And it now actually has an official indication for cytokine release syndrome in the US. Again, the CRS correlates with disease burden, so patients with the highest CRS tend to have the highest amount of bone marrow blasts at the time of treatment. Patients without a CRS tend to have low amounts of disease at treatment. And so once we've, all of that sort of, we learned how to manage all of that, and with the results of the phase 1 and the phase 2 trial, United States FDA approved CAR T-cell therapy, and the trade name for that is Kymriah, for children and young adults up to 25. Right now, the product that is sold by Novartis is indicated for ALL up to age 25, refractory patients or second relapse, so not first remission. Other key points, the patients, I think this is really key for us, do not need to be in a complete remission to receive treatment. So patients in the past that we were trying to get to bone marrow transplant, but we couldn't get there because they couldn't get a chemotherapeutic response to their disease, are now being able to go to Kymriah. And obviously you don't need a donor, so it's a little quicker than doing a transplant. I will say, as everyone knows, it's tremendously expensive, and it's not universally available. So it's only being given in a couple of a handful of centers in the US, and many patients are not able to access this right now. There are many clinical trials continuing to go on in centers across the US with different kinds of CARs and different generations, and I'm going to talk about a couple of those right now. Because our hope really is, I mean, it's not reasonable for most patients to get this treatment right now, but the hope is that years down the road, this will become a therapy that is much more accessible and less expensive for everyone. So, as we saw, many or most of these patients get a complete response to the treatment, but then they start to relapse almost immediately. So what are the mechanisms of that relapse? We think some of the patients are relapsing with CD19 positive disease. So that's discouraging. And we think that some of that is because there's something wrong with their T-cell product. But some of it may be that their immune system is for some reason rejecting that T-cell product that, made from their own T-cells, and why would that be? And we'll talk about that. And then some patients are having a CD19 relapse, a CD19 negative relapse. And in that case, how is the leukemia dealing? What is the leukemia doing to get rid of the CD19 and morph into a CD19 negative leukemia that's then not responsive to the persistent CAR T cells? So the researchers at CHOP started thinking about the way that the CAR was constructed in terms of the patients with CD19 positive relapses. And they thought about, in the first round of the CAR, this antibody region is murine, it comes from a mouse. And so they wondered if in some way the patients, even though they were heavily pretreated and immunosuppressed, were reacting to the murine component of the CAR. And so they made a new CAR that has a humanized antibody portion. And they're calling it 119 instead of CTLL19, and it's called a humanized CAR. And so we did at CHOP a phase 1 clinical trial of the humanized CAR, and there were two groups of patients that were eligible for this trial. The first was patients with relapsed and refractory CD19 disease that had been previously treated with the CAR-T19 treatment, and had either had a partial or no response, had relapsed, or demonstrated B-cell recovery while they were still in remission, because that tells us that the CAR isn't working. And then there was another group that had not previously been treated with CAR-T that was eligible to get CAR-T for relapse refractory diseases. The patient characteristics of this group, so about 60% had already had a bone marrow transplant. All of them except one had B-ALL, and there was one with B lymphoblastic lymphoma. And you can see the disease there. 65% were in a second or greater relapse. 19% had a CNS relapse, and 16% extramedullary relapse in other areas. And about a third of the patients had more than 5% blasts, and about half had no detectable blasts at the time of the cell infusion. So in the retreatment cohort, there were 15 patients who had been previously treated with CART, and 9 of them went into a complete remission. And you can see on this plot here, the green are the patients that went into remission. They've been followed out as long as 15 months now. 1 patient relapsed actually at 16 months. There were 5 patients that didn't respond, and a couple patients that have relapsed. So not bad. But in the CAR-naive cohort, all of the patients responded. All 22 went into a CR. And they've had persistent CRs for a long time. So we have had some relapses. Several patients relapsed at 3, 4, and 5 months. But some of these kids are now followed up over a year and are still in remission. So that seems to be working. That, you know, for some reason those patients were recognizing that murine as not murine antibody piece of the CAR as not self, and were rejecting it. And the humanized CAR seems to have some potential in those patients, but actually maybe even more potential in the patients who hadn't been treated with CAR yet at all. And again, these are just the survival plots to show you those same numbers. In the CAR-naive cohort, again, we got a big response. At 12 months, it's 86% relapse-free survival, so better than with the other CARs. And in the previously treated patients, about 52%. So when we think about the CD19 relapse and antigen escape, we think about just how is CD19 deleting or mutating or no longer expressed. And I think this slide just has, and this is complicated, this is from my friend Dave Barrett, who works in Steve Grupp's lab, and he's just looked at CD19 and found some hotspots for where he thinks the CD19 in these leukemia cells may be getting mutated. So clearly at exon 2 and exon 5, 6, down here there are some hotspots that are getting spliced. And then at the orange and the blue, there are hotspots that seem to be places that frame shift and that there are being mutations. And so they're looking at this to try and figure out how the leukemia cells are mutating the CD19 so that it's not detectable by the CARs. I think the easiest thing to fix this right now is to find a CAR that's directed against something other than CD19. And the researchers right now are working on a CD22 CAR that they've just started clinical trials with to see if that's going to be able to bypass this altogether. So what's the overall potential for immunotherapy? Because as we said, it's really not widely available, and it's very, very expensive. I think we've shown that it can reinduce remission in patients who are chemotherapy refractive, but can we achieve long-term remissions? I don't know. We can overcome relapse due to short persistence with a humanized CAR. We're trying to overcome relapse due to antigen escape with CARs directed at other proteins. The access for this has been expanding. Although the FDA has approved it and there's now a commercial product, there are still lots of clinical trials going on across the world looking at newer versions of this and newer uses for this therapy, so I think that's important. And there is talk in the Children's Oncology Group of trying to identify an extremely high-risk group of children at diagnosis or at the end of the first month of therapy that might benefit from this without going through all of the chemotherapy. And we'll see if that's going to happen in a clinical trial. So CAR-T therapy has also been tried in B-cell lymphomas. Now, I will say that almost all of the data that is out there about B-cell lymphomas with CAR-T is in adults. And part of that, I think, is that the B-cell lymphomas that adults get, diffuse large B and follicular lymphomas, move a little bit more slowly than the large B-cell lymphomas that we see in children and teenagers. And even at CHOP, we have only managed to treat 1 child with large B-cell lymphoma that's relapsed. Because those children, when they relapse, the disease moves so fast, we can't control it with chemo, and we can't keep them, frankly, can't keep them alive for the 2 months it takes to manufacture the product. So I think we still have some work to do in terms of large B-cell lymphoma treatment for CART, but I want to talk a little bit about what's going on in the adults because it is hopeful. So Novartis did a multi-center phase 2 called Juliet, looking at, I can't pronounce the real name of CART, Tisgen Leklusel, I think. in adult patients with relapsed and refractory diffuse large B lymphoma. And they showed a 3-month overall response rate of about 45%, so not like the leukemia, but still okay, with 37% achieving a CR and about 8% with a PR. And here are the graphs for that. They also looked at follicular lymphoma. This was reported by Steve Schuster in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2017. So this is the diffuse large B event-free survival, and it went leveled out around the 40s, the mid-40s. The follicular lymphomas have a much higher progression-free survival, but then we all know that follicular lymphoma is very indolent, and so it takes a long time for that to relapse. So I think it's not quite the same to look at that plot and compare it to a diffuse large B. And these are just the overall survival plots. And again, you see a fall off in the diffuse large Bs, whereas in the follicular lymphomas, they're continuing to stay alive. There's also this, another unpronounceable anti-CD19 CAR we're going to call Axicell, run in the ZUMA-1 trial. Axicell is an autologous anti-CD19 CAR T product. And ZUMA was a phase 2 trial that looked at patients with refractory diffuse large B-cell, primary mediastinal B, which I think we see in some of our teenagers, as we've heard, and transformed follicular lymphoma. They were able to give the Axicell to over 100 patients, and they got an objective response rate of about 82%. So this is diffuse large B, about 82, primary mediastinal B, or transformed follicular, and this is the overall rate. So pretty good. They had a complete response in 82, a stable disease in 11%, and then disease progression in a small number of patients. And at median follow-up of about 15 months, 42% of the patients continue to have a response, with about 40% in a complete response. So these are the complete response, objective response, and no response here. And so overall, the survival at 18 months is about 52%. And again, just as with ALL, the higher CAR T levels in the blood were associated with the response. So there is also some look out there in lymphomas at targets other than CD19. There's reported by Till in Blood in 2012, so this is fairly old, a third generation CD20 specific CAR with the CD28 and 41BB, which this is what the CD19 looks like. Co-stimulatory domains, 3 adult patients, but again, indolent B-cell lymphomas, and they did very well. An anti-CD20 CAR for relapsed refractory B-cell lymphoma, reported by Zhang, and they treated 11 patients and saw a CR in 6 of them. The progression-free survival was greater than 6 months in all, but only 1 patient made it to 27 months. And then a CAR specific for the kappa light chain that recognizes kappa-restricted cells. So it actually spares the normal B cells expressing non-targeted gamma light chain. This was a phase 1 trial that infused 16 patients with refractory kappa-positive NHL, CLL, or multiple myeloma, obviously not a kid disease. And again, 9 patients with relapsed NHL or CLL, only 2 entered a complete remission. So I think we still have a way to go with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and CAR T therapy. So in summary, I think we know that patients with chemotherapy refractory B-cell malignancies have a significant response with CAR T19 treatments. It remains to be seen if those responses will be truly long-term. We've learned how to manage the treatment toxicity very well. The new strategies to address immune tolerance and antigen escape may improve responses and allow salvage for patients who have had a suboptimal response to the initial CAR T therapy. Relapsed and refractory B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma in children may respond to CAR T19 therapy if we can figure out a way to get the children to the therapy. And newer CAR 19 therapy indications may be for very high-risk subsets of newly diagnosed patients with B-cell malignancies. I just want to thank the members of the CHOP Cancer Immunotherapy Program who have done all of this work, Steve Grupp, and all the people in his lab and his program who work on all of this, and actually helped me with some of their slides, which was very nice.